March 15, 1963. 2:47 a.m. The phone rang in a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park. On the other end of the line was a voice trembling with fear and desperation. "Mr. Johnson, they've got my daughter. They say if I don't talk, she dies tonight." The caller was Detective Ray Morrison, a man who had spent 15 years building cases against organized crime in New York City. But tonight, he wasn't calling as a cop. He was calling as a father whose 8-year-old girl had been snatched from her bedroom window while he slept downstairs. And he was calling the one man in all of New York who the Italian mob genuinely feared: Bumpy Johnson. What happened in the next 6 hours would become the stuff of legend in Harlem's streets, whispered about in barbershops and pool halls for decades to come. But this story, this incredible display of power and principle that saved an innocent child's life, has been deliberately buried by Hollywood, erased from history books, and forgotten by a world that prefers its heroes simple and its villains even simpler. Because the truth about Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, doesn't fit the narrative they want to tell. See, when most people hear the name Bumpy Johnson, if they recognize it at all, they think of a character from a movie or a Netflix series. They think of just another criminal, another gangster, another bad guy with a gun and an attitude. But the real Bumpy Johnson was something Hollywood can't comprehend and won't portray. He was a man who turned organized crime into organized protection, who transformed the brutal mathematics of street survival into a sophisticated system of community defense. He was the King of Harlem who never surrendered, not to the police, not to the politicians, and certainly not to the 5 Italian families who tried everything in their power to break him. The night Detective Morrison called, Bumpy was already dying. Lung cancer was eating him alive from the inside out. He had maybe 6 months left, 8 if he was lucky. The smart play, the safe play, would have been to hang up that phone, roll over, and let someone else deal with the mess. But Bumpy Johnson had never made the smart play when the right play was available. And saving a child's life was always the right play. What you need to understand about Bumpy is that his power didn't come from violence, though he was more than capable of violence when necessary. His power came from something far more dangerous to the established order. His power came from legitimacy. In a neighborhood where the police were either corrupt or useless, where politicians sold their votes to the highest bidder, where banks redlined entire blocks and landlords squeezed families dry, Bumpy Johnson provided what the system wouldn't: justice, protection, dignity. By 1963, Bumpy had been running Harlem's numbers racket for over 2 decades. But calling it a numbers racket is like calling the Underground Railroad a transportation service. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. The numbers game in Harlem wasn't just gambling. It was the community's bank, its insurance company, its social safety net, all rolled into one. When Mrs. Williams from 125th Street hit the number for $50, that money didn't disappear into some corporate vault. It stayed in the neighborhood. It paid for groceries, for school clothes, for medicine that the city hospitals wouldn't provide. And Bumpy made sure the game stayed clean. Tried to cheat a customer on Bumpy's watch, you'd find yourself explaining your actions to a very unsympathetic audience. Tried to muscle in on someone's corner without permission, you'd discover that Bumpy's enforcement came swift and permanent. Try to harm an innocent person in Harlem, and you'd learn why even the hardest men in New York spoke his name with respect. This is what the Italian families could never understand. They saw the money flowing through Harlem, millions of dollars a year, and they thought it was just sitting there waiting to be taken. They figured all they had to do was eliminate one man, install their own people, and the cash would start flowing uptown to their social clubs and restaurants. What they didn't realize is that they weren't just dealing with one man. They were dealing with an entire community that saw Bumpy Johnson as their protector, their advocate, their last line of defense against a world that wanted to grind them into dust. The 5 families had tried everything. In 1959, they sent Tommy, the Blade, Torino and 6 of his best men to take over the numbers running on Lenox Avenue. Tommy was a killer, a man who had personally eliminated 17 people for the Genovese family. He figured 6 men with guns could handle whatever Harlem threw at them. He was wrong. When Tommy and his crew tried to collect from the first number runner, they found themselves surrounded by 40 neighborhood residents. Not gangsters. Not criminals. Ordinary people. Shopkeepers, janitors, cab drivers, seamstresses. People who worked 12-hour days and raised their children in tiny apartments, and knew that Bumpy Johnson was the only thing standing between their families and complete chaos. Tommy pulled his gun. Bad mistake. Within seconds he had 5 guns pointed at his head. But nobody shot. That wasn't Bumpy's way. Instead, the crowd parted, and Bumpy Johnson walked through, calm as Sunday morning, wearing his signature 3-piece suit and polished shoes. He looked Tommy up and down like he was examining an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. "Mr. Torino," Bumpy said, his voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the morning air. "I believe you've made a wrong turn. Lenox Avenue runs north and south. The highway back to Little Italy runs east and west. I suggest you find it." Tommy tried to bluster, tried to explain that he had backing, that the families wouldn't stand for disrespect. Bumpy listened patiently, nodding occasionally like a teacher helping a slow student work through a difficult problem. When Tommy finished, Bumpy smiled. "Son," he said, "you seem to be confused about something fundamental. You think you're in New York City. You're not. You're in Harlem. And in Harlem, there's only one family that matters. Mine." What happened next became the stuff of legend. Bumpy didn't order Tommy beaten or killed. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He made Tommy irrelevant. He turned to the crowd and spoke in a voice everyone could hear. "This man believes he can come into our neighborhood and take what we've built. He thinks because his bosses wear expensive suits and own restaurants in Manhattan, he can push around the people I've sworn to protect. He's wrong about that. But I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to educate him." Bumpy reached into his jacket, and every muscle in the crowd tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out his wallet. He counted out $1,000 in crisp $100 bills. Then he handed the money to Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who ran a small grocery store on the corner. "Mrs. Patterson," Bumpy said, "I want you to take this money and buy groceries for every family on this block. Good groceries. Meat, vegetables, bread, milk. Whatever they need." He turned back to Tommy. "You see, Mr. Torino, you came here to take money out of this community. I'm putting money into it. You came here to create fear. I'm creating security. You came here representing people who see Harlem as something to be exploited. I represent people who see Harlem as something to be protected." The message was clear, and it spread through the 5 families' ranks like wildfire. You couldn't muscle Bumpy Johnson because he wasn't just one man with a gun. He was the heart of an entire community, and that community would fight to protect him just as fiercely as he fought to protect them. But by 1962, the families were getting desperate. The numbers racket was more lucrative than ever, and Bumpy showed no signs of backing down despite increasing pressure from law enforcement and political enemies. Frank Costello, by then the most powerful mob boss in New York, decided it was time for a different approach. If they couldn't destroy Bumpy from the outside, they'd have to destroy him from the inside. That's when they approached Marcus, Little Man, Williams. Little Man was Bumpy's accountant, the guy who kept track of all the money flowing through the operation. He was smart, quiet, and trusted. He was also drowning in gambling debts to a loan shark named Vince, the Fish, Marconi. The Fish was connected to the Lucchese family, and when they heard about Little Man's situation, they saw an opportunity. The approach was subtle. No threats, no violence. Just a friendly conversation. The Fish called Little Man to a meeting at a quiet restaurant in Queens. Over coffee and cannoli, he laid out the situation. The debt was forgiven. In fact, there was $50,000 waiting for Little Man if he was willing to provide some information. Nothing that would directly hurt Bumpy. Just schedules, routines, places he might be vulnerable. Little Man took the deal. He told himself he wasn't really betraying Bumpy, just providing harmless information. He told himself the families would never actually hurt Bumpy, they just wanted to scare him into negotiating. He told himself a lot of things that helped him sleep at night, right up until the moment he realized what his information had been used for. March 12, 1963. Bumpy was scheduled to attend a community meeting at Abyssinian Baptist Church. The church was a fortress, filled with people who would die before they let anything happen to Bumpy. But the meeting had been moved at the last minute to a smaller venue, and only a few trusted people knew about the change. Little Man was one of them. When Bumpy arrived at the new location, a community center on 135th Street, he found it empty except for 4 men in expensive suits. Italian men. Men with guns drawn and expressions that meant business. This should have been the end of the story. 4 professional killers, a mostly empty building, and Bumpy Johnson walking in alone and unarmed. But Bumpy didn't become the King of Harlem by making rookie mistakes. The moment he saw those empty chairs, he knew he'd been set up. And the moment he knew he'd been set up, his mind went to work on the problem of staying alive long enough to figure out who had betrayed him and why. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, walking into the room like he owned it, "I have to say, this is disappointing. When the Italians finally decide to make a real move, I expected more style. More class. This feels rushed. Sloppy." The gunmen exchanged glances. They'd been expecting fear, panic, maybe an attempt to run or fight. They weren't expecting a fashion critique. "You talk a lot for a dead man," said the apparent leader, a thin man with cold eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his chin. "Maybe it's time you learned when to shut up." Bumpy smiled. "Maybe it is. But before I do, I'm curious about something. You boys know who you're working for?" "We know enough," Scarface replied. "We know you're the problem, and we're the solution." "Interesting," Bumpy said, settling into a chair like he was planning to stay a while. "See, I think you're operating under some false assumptions. You think this is about business. You think your bosses sent you here to eliminate competition. But that's not what this is about at all." What Bumpy knew, and what the gunman didn't, was that this hit wasn't sanctioned by all 5 families. It was a rogue operation, ordered by Frank Costello without consulting the other bosses. Costello was making a power play, trying to grab the Harlem territory before anyone else could react. If the hit succeeded, he'd present it to the commission as a fait accompli. If it failed, he'd deny any involvement and let the gunman take the blame. But Bumpy had sources everywhere, including inside Costello's own organization. He'd known about the planned hit for 3 days. More importantly, he'd made some phone calls. "You see, boys," Bumpy continued, his voice conversational and calm. "Your boss, Mr. Costello, has put you in what we might call a compromising position. He's told you this hit has full commission approval. He's told you that taking me out will make you heroes in your families. He's told you a lot of things. But he hasn't told you the truth." The gunmen were getting nervous now. This wasn't how hits were supposed to go. The target was supposed to beg, or fight, or try to run. He wasn't supposed to sit there like he was conducting a business meeting. "The truth," Bumpy said, "is that Vito Genovese thinks this hit is premature and dangerous. The truth is that Carlo Gambino has explicitly said he wants no part of a war in Harlem. The truth is that Tommy Lucchese has already told his people that anyone who participates in unsanctioned violence against me will be cut loose from family protection." Scarface was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You're lying. Trying to save your skin with fancy talk." Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, and pulled out a small tape recorder. He set it on the table between them and pressed play. The voice that came out of the speaker was gravelly, with a thick Italian accent. But it was unmistakable to anyone who knew the players in New York's organized crime scene. It was Vito Genovese himself, recorded during a phone conversation just 2 hours earlier. "Frank's lost his mind with this Harlem thing," Genovese's voice said through the static. "He thinks he can move without commission approval. He thinks he can start a war with Johnson without consulting the rest of us. Well, he's wrong. And when his cowboys get themselves killed tonight, I'm going to personally explain to him why freelancing is bad for business." The gunman stared at the tape recorder like it was a snake. Bumpy calmly reached over and stopped the playback. "No," he said. "I believe we have some things to discuss. Because you gentlemen have a choice to make. You can follow through with Costello's orders and hope he protects you when the Commission finds out you've started an unauthorized war. Or you can walk away right now, alive and with your family standing intact, and let me deal with Mr. Costello in my own way." What happened next would be talked about in mob circles for years. One by one, the gunmen put their weapons away. Scarface was the last to lower his gun, his hand shaking slightly as he realized how close he'd come to starting a war that would have destroyed his entire crew. "This ain't over, Johnson," he said, trying to salvage some dignity. "Costello won't forget this." Bumpy stood up, straightening his tie. "No, Mr. Torino," he said, and the gunman's eyes widened as he realized Bumpy knew his name, his family connections, probably his home address and his children's schools. "This is over. What happens next is up to your boss." The gunman filed out, leaving Bumpy alone in the empty community center. But he wasn't alone for long. Within minutes, the door opened again, and Detective Ray Morrison walked in. Morrison was one of the few honest cops in New York, a man who'd spent years trying to build cases against the mob families. He was also a man who understood that sometimes the enemy of your enemy was your friend. "You know they'll try again," Morrison said without preamble. "Costello's not going to just forget about this." "Probably not," Bumpy agreed. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight's problem was staying alive long enough to have a tomorrow. Mission accomplished." What Morrison didn't know, what none of the players in this game knew, was that Bumpy had been playing a much deeper game. The tape recording of Genovese wasn't obtained through traditional surveillance. It was provided by someone inside Genovese's inner circle, someone who had been feeding information to Bumpy for months. Someone who understood that a war between the families and Bumpy Johnson would hurt everyone involved. That someone was Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno, Genovese's lieutenant and a man who would later become one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York history. But in 1963, Fat Tony was a pragmatist who understood that Bumpy Johnson provided something valuable to the families: stability. As long as Bumpy controlled Harlem, there was no chaos, no random violence, no unpredictable variables that could complicate other operations. Fat Tony had been the one to tip Bumpy off about the hit. He'd been the one to provide the recording. And he'd been the one to suggest a solution that would benefit everyone involved. 2 days later, Frank Costello received a visitor at his social club in Little Italy. The visitor was well-dressed, polite, and completely respectful. He was also carrying a briefcase containing photographs of Costello's grandchildren playing in their school playground, copies of his wife's daily schedule, and detailed floor plans of his heavily secured Long Island estate. The message was clear without being stated. Bumpy Johnson could reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. But he chose not to. He chose to talk instead of act, to negotiate instead of eliminate. He chose to be reasonable, as long as reasonableness was reciprocated. Costello got the message. The hit stopped. The pressure eased. And Bumpy Johnson continued to rule Harlem with the kind of quiet authority that comes not from fear, but from genuine respect. But this is where the story gets really interesting, because what happened over the next few months reveals just how sophisticated Bumpy's operation really was. See, most people think organized crime is about violence and intimidation. And sure, those are tools that criminals use. But the really successful criminals, the ones who build lasting power, understand that violence is expensive, unpredictable, and ultimately unsustainable. The real power comes from providing services that people need and can't get anywhere else. Bumpy Johnson had built something unprecedented in American organized crime. He'd built a criminal organization that actually served its community. The numbers racket wasn't just gambling, it was community banking for people who couldn't get bank accounts. Bumpy's enforcers weren't just muscle, they were neighborhood peacekeepers who kept the streets safe for families and children. Bumpy's political connections weren't just corruption, they were advocacy for a community that had no other voice in City Hall. This is why Hollywood can't tell his story honestly. Because the real story of Bumpy Johnson exposes uncomfortable truths about how American society actually works. It reveals that sometimes the criminals are more trustworthy than the cops, that sometimes the illegal economy serves people better than the legal one, that sometimes the guy everyone calls a gangster is actually the only person fighting for justice in a fundamentally unjust system. And that brings us back to that phone call on March 15, 1963. Detective Morrison's daughter had been kidnapped by associates of the Marconi crew, the same loan sharks who had corrupted little man Williams. They wanted Morrison to destroy his files on Italian mob operations in Brooklyn. They wanted him to testify that his evidence had been obtained illegally. They wanted him to single-handedly sabotage the biggest organized crime prosecution in New York history. Morrison could have done it. He could have saved his daughter by betraying his oath, his duty, and his conscience. Instead, he called the one man in New York who had the power to help and the reputation for keeping his word. Bumpy listened to Morrison's story without interruption. When the detective finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Finally, Bumpy spoke. "Detective, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your daughter will be home safe before sunrise. The men who took her will never threaten your family again. And your case files will remain intact. But I need something from you in return." "Anything," Morrison said immediately. "Name it. I need you to understand something about the world you're fighting to clean up. The men who took your daughter, they're not aberrations. They're not exceptions to the rule. They are the rule. They represent the natural end result of a system that puts profit above people and power above justice. You've spent 15 years trying to arrest your way out of this problem. How's that working out for you?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Not so well," he admitted. "Right. So maybe it's time to try a different approach. Maybe it's time to recognize that sometimes the solution to the problem looks a lot like the problem itself. Maybe it's time to understand that justice and law aren't always the same thing." What Bumpy did next took exactly 4 hours and involved no violence whatsoever. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to Fat Tony Salerno. The second was to a man named Jimmy, the Fish, who ran numbers for the Lucchese family. The third was to Detective Morrison's captain, a man named Patrick O'Brien who owed Bumpy several favors dating back to 1959. By 6 a.m., Morrison's daughter was safe at home. The men who had kidnapped her were in custody, arrested by federal agents on charges completely unrelated to the kidnapping. And Morrison's case files were not only intact, they'd been supplemented with additional evidence that would eventually put 17 mob figures behind bars for a combined total of 300 years. The genius of Bumpy's solution was that everyone got what they really needed. Morrison got his daughter back and his case remained solid. The federal agents got credit for a major bust that advanced their careers. The mob families got rid of some loose cannons who'd been causing problems for months. And Bumpy got something more valuable than money or territory. He got confirmation that his word was still respected by everyone who mattered. But the story doesn't end there. Because 3 months later, Bumpy Johnson was dead. Not killed by rival gangsters or corrupt cops or federal agents. Killed by lung cancer, the same disease that had been eating away at him for over a year. He died at home, in his own bed, surrounded by friends and family. He died having never surrendered, never compromised his principles, and never backed down from a fight that mattered. At his funeral, something unprecedented happened. The church was packed with an impossible mix of people. There were numbers runners and community activists, police detectives and federal agents, politicians and preachers, gangsters and social workers. There were people who had been helped by Bumpy's generosity, and people who had been humbled by his power. There were enemies who respected him and friends who loved him. Detective Morrison was there, sitting in the back with his daughter beside him. Fat Tony Salerno was there, paying his respects to a man he'd learned to trust even though they'd never met face to face. Little man Williams was there too, weeping openly for the man he'd betrayed and who had forgiven him anyway. But the most telling moment came when the preacher asked if anyone wanted to speak about Bumpy's life. An elderly woman named Mrs. Washington stood up. She was small, bent with age, wearing a simple black dress and a hat that had seen better days. She walked slowly to the front of the church, turned to face the crowd, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the packed sanctuary. "Y'all knew Bumpy Johnson the kingpin," she said. "Y'all knew Bumpy Johnson the numbers man. Y'all knew Bumpy Johnson the gangster. But I knew Bumpy Johnson the man who made sure my grandchildren had Christmas presents when their father lost his job. I knew Bumpy Johnson the man who paid for my grandson's hospital bills when he got pneumonia and we didn't have insurance. I knew Bumpy Johnson the man who walked my granddaughter to school every day for a month when the older kids were picking on her." She paused, looking around the church, meeting the eyes of cops and criminals alike. "Some of y'all spent your whole lives trying to put Bumpy in prison. Some of y'all spent your whole lives working for him. But all of y'all are here today because you know the same thing I know. Bumpy Johnson was the kind of man this world doesn't make anymore. The kind of man who understood that power without principle is just bullying, and money without morality is just greed. The kind of man who proved that you can be strong without being cruel, that you can be feared without being hated, that you can be a criminal without being a villain." The church was silent when she finished. There was nothing to add, nothing to argue with, nothing to explain. Mrs. Washington had said what everyone in that room knew but couldn't articulate. Bumpy Johnson had been something special, something that didn't fit into the neat categories that society uses to organize its heroes and villains. And that's why Hollywood won't tell his real story? Because the real story of Bumpy Johnson reveals uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and community in America. It reveals that sometimes the system fails so completely that decent people have no choice but to work outside it. It reveals that sometimes the guy everyone calls a criminal is actually more moral than the people everyone calls heroes. The King of Harlem never surrendered because he understood something that his enemies never learned. True power doesn't come from the barrel of a gun or the balance of a bank account. True power comes from earning the trust and respect of people who have every reason not to trust or respect anyone. True power comes from being the person others turn to when everything else has failed. Bumpy Johnson was that person for Harlem, for over 30 years. And when he died, he took that knowledge with him, leaving behind only stories, legends, and the memory of what real leadership looks like when it emerges from the streets instead of the suites. That's the story Hollywood doesn't want to tell. Because it's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about who the real heroes are, and why we need them in the first place.